Good evening, I'm Mike Malone. October 17th did more than just shake the ground beneath us. It also rattled our complacency about living in earthquake country. The big one is now more than just a vague possibility. But will the Bay Area be ready for it when it comes? Our guest tonight, Richard Eisner, Executive Director of the Bay Area Regional Earthquake Preparedness Project, and Peter Ward, a seismologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Stay tuned, I know you'll find it worthwhile. I think we should start with October 17th and the Loma Prieta quake. It sort of focused everyone's minds, it riveted our attention on what earthquakes can do and their possibility. How well did you all do at predicting that quake?
Well, what's important is that this was an area on the San Andreas Fault that we thought there was a very high likelihood of a major earthquake. Yeah. We were not able to predict the specific occurrence of this earthquake because we had not been able to instrument this area. But we had said in '88 that there was a 30% probability that an earthquake of this size is likely to occur on the San Andreas Fault in the next 30 years.
Okay. 20 months later.
Yeah, we used that information. We've been working with USGS now since 1980 and taking the probabilities information that's been published, getting to the local governments and showing them the risks that they face. And as early as 1984, we published a report that showed this area was at increased risk because of the segment of the fault. And we focused our efforts.
How do you know that you have an increased risk? Is there any kind of methodology you use to see that a particular region is beginning to show earthquake potential?
Basically, most earthquakes in California that we're worried about are related to movement of the Pacific Plate to North America and the stress that's being relieved over time. Yeah. And this stress is relieved in major earthquakes. And if we look at the locations of earthquakes with time, we find that there are places where there haven't been many earthquakes in recent time. So the stress is building up. And this was the way this area was identified. It was a gap, what we call a seismic gap. So it was a place we expected an earthquake.
So that's a stretch of ground where you haven't had enough earthquakes to relieve the stress.
It's a stress of fault. It's a part of the fault that goes down through the earth where energy has not been relieved, where there hasn't been enough motion to keep up with the motions that are going on in the larger area in recent time.
Now, in these gaps, I've seen charts where you see a cluster of quakes along one stretch and all of a sudden it diminishes and you see a cluster again. And that's the pinpoint area. But there's also something called bowing, too. So I understand. What is that?
Well, not bowing, but there's typically, when you look at the gap, there's small earthquakes underneath the gap area that we find
very deep.
When they occur at depths of 11 or 12 miles. Okay. When they occur, then that begins to suggest that maybe this gap is getting ready to break. Okay. So the probabilities that we've issued are based on, one, the recognition of that gap, and two, some understanding of what the history and the seismicity in that area has been over a long period of time.
But now a quake is a discontinuity, right? I mean, you can't say exactly when it's going to happen because there's so many factors involved, and it's a tension then a giving way.
But currently we cannot predict in real time in 2 or 3 or 4 days, but we can identify those areas, as Peter noted, where there are gaps, where there haven't been earthquakes. And in fact, the 2 years preceding Loma Prieta, we issued 2 advisories for potentially large quakes in that area. One in 1987, after the Lake Ellesmere earthquake. We thought this could have been a foreshock to a larger event. And then the second in the Lexington Reservoir earthquake in 1989, 3 months before the quake. Again, we had a quake that we thought could be a foreshock, but nothing occurred. So we were watching this area, and we were looking for these kinds of events which indicate larger quakes.
Trouble is, how vigilant can you be if the prediction is 30% within the next 20 years? I mean, can you stay mobilized for 20 years to get ready for a quake if it's only a 1 in 3 chance?
Well, we're studying the quakes all the time, and there's a great deal of work that would need to be done to be able to predict clearly when the next earthquake would occur. But in order to study the position of earthquakes with time, we're doing that rather carefully along the Hayward Fault in the East Bay, along the San Andreas Fault, and the faults to the south. So that as we watch the change in seismicity, it's something that we can see. Now, we have much of that data is being processed automatically by computers, and there are people that have beepers that go off when something abnormal occurs. And we're going to be releasing that information as quickly as we see any possibility of a change. So that people need to understand that they may be hearing not just a probability, but a more specific suggestion that an earthquake might be imminent. Then it's important that they understand what the hazard is to them.
The other thing is, it's not just 1 in 3 chances in 30 years. It could be today. It could be while we're sitting doing this tape, the earthquake occurring. It's not at the end of the 30-year period. The probabilities are very significant that we're going to have a quake in the next 30 years. We just don't know when. Sure,
but what I'm saying is, after a certain amount of time, you begin to get lulled into complacency. That, if it doesn't happen now, if it doesn't happen in 5 years, I've lived here for 30 years, and I see you have a quake, you become distressed by it, something has to be done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A couple years go by, and you sort of put it on the back burner, and you go on, you build more freeways, you do whatever you have to do.
The Loma Prieta earthquake was the largest earthquake to shake the San Francisco Bay region since 1906. But when we look at the recent history during the 19th century in this area, we find there was an earthquake almost the size of the Loma Prieta earthquake about every decade in the late 1800s. So it's very important that we not get complacent, and we really should look at the Loma Prieta earthquake as a warning shot.
So it's a precursor to a new period of high seismic activity?
We think the stresses are probably building up again to the point where we are going to begin to see more magnitude 6.5, 7 earthquakes, leading up eventually to a magnitude 8.
Now, if I remember my 19th century local history, San Francisco actually got flattened twice in the course of 30 years.
It was 1868, the last Hayward earthquake leveled San Francisco as well as most of the East Bay.
Okay, well, let's talk about then the Hayward Fault, because that's the scary one right now, as I understand it. Is there any validity to the notion that oftentimes there's a doubling, twinning process between a quake on the San Andreas Fault, like Loma Prieta, followed up soon thereafter, within a couple, 3 years, by the Hayward Fault?
Well, there was an earthquake in 1865 on the same segment of the San Andreas Fault that the Loma Prieta earthquake was. In other words, there was another earthquake just like Loma Prieta. 3 years later, there was a major earthquake on the Hayward Fault in the East Bay. Now, that's one example. Is that going to be typical or not? We really can't say, but it's certainly possible.
But now, the numbers on the Hayward Fault are absolutely terrifying, because it's such a high-density area all the way along the East Bay. As I understand it, runs right through Cal Stadium in Berkeley.
Well, the fault runs from Fremont through Point Pinole, under Berkeley, Oakland, San Leandro, Hayward, the most populated part of the East Bay.
How many? Was it 2 or 3 million people?
Probably 2.5 million people.
Okay, let me read you some numbers. The California Division of Mines and Geology expects the following effects of a 7.5 magnitude trembler on the Hayward Fault: 1,500 to 4,500 deaths, 45,000 to 135,000 injuries, more than $40 billion worth of damage, all 4 bridges across the bay wrecked, and all the airports out, except perhaps San Jose International.
That's surprising. I mean, we just had a Loma Prieta quake that was 80 miles away from Oakland. We had bridges go down. We had liquefaction or soil flows adjacent to the bay. We had old brick buildings fail and collapse. We had concrete buildings being damaged. I think that the numbers that you just read are not only an indication of the potential for a Hayward quake, but they've been validated by the quake we just had.
What's impressive is the Loma Prieta earthquake was in the mountains of Santa Cruz, a fairly remote area. And when you go up there and talk to the people that were right in the epicentral area, you find that some of them were thrown from their buildings. A van was overturned. Treetops were broken off. Ground caved in a number of places, and many buildings were just shook completely off their foundations. And when you visualize that type of damage going through the center of Hayward, San Leandro, Berkeley, Oakland, it's a little bit scary.
Give me the odds. 20% is the official number?
20% is currently the official number. The U.S. Geological Survey is now reassessing the probabilities, and I believe they're going to be higher.
Like what, 30?
I think these numbers tend to be fairly conservative. And the fact is the earthquake's coming. There's no question that the earthquake is coming. It may be in the next minute. It may be in 10 years. It may be in 30 years. I think most seismologists believe that it's more imminent than just 20% in 30 years.
Okay, before we get into what we can do about it, let's talk about the other likely areas. Northern Peninsula?
The central part of the peninsula from San Jose north up to Daly City is an area that is probably have an increased probability after Loma Prieta. It's an area that didn't have as much ground motion.
So you sort of a serial effect on this? If you move one segment, then the adjoining ones go under increased stress and they're more likely to experience a quake? Is that how it works?
To some extent. The peninsula section, it was a gap that had been identified before the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the existence of the Loma Prieta earthquake probably increased that chances a little bit on the peninsula, but it still is basically a gap.
Yeah, how about the Daly City to Point Reyes section?
Well, my understanding is that that's a lower probability. I think the real issue, though, is not the probability of individual segments of the fault, but we know we have at least 10 major faults in the region, any one of which can let go with a 6.5 or larger quake. Now, if we get preoccupied with the San Andreas or the Hayward, maybe be missing the Rogers Creek or the Calaveras or the Greenwood. All of these faults are potential killers. They underlie the entire region. These are the ones we know about. And in Coalinga in 1983, it was an unmapped fault that caused that damage. In Whittier, it was an unmapped fault. In San Fernando in 1971, it was an unmapped fault. I think that the message is we live in an area of very high seismic risk. Regardless of the fault, these events can occur at any time. And by doing things now, we change the outcome. If we strengthen buildings now, if we train our citizens, if we know what to do when the earthquake starts, we change the outcome of the earthquake.
Let's talk about federal policy, state policy, and local. What should we be doing? I know at the, I was sort of stunned to read that the entire budget for earth sciences in the United States is $60 million a year. That's less than the cost of one B-1 bomber. And that the amount of money funded to the USGS for earthquake-related research has fallen by 40 to 50% in real terms since '78. Why aren't we putting money into this thing?
Well, the number you're giving is for research in earthquakes, both engineering and earth science.
Yeah.
It's the $60 million a year.
Yeah, but that's the front end, right?
And that money was appropriated in 1977 in an act in Congress. Since that time, it's been level funded. And so with inflation, it means the program has been decreasing.
So are you all underfunded in your research?
Certainly it's been very difficult to pursue the channels that we thought. For example, in order to predict an earthquake, we need to put dense instrumentation on the fault. We've only been able to instrument one area. That's the Parkfield area in central California, south of San Juan Bautista, where there's essentially a... You're
talking about borehole strain gauges, that sort of thing?
Borehole instruments, surface instruments, many, many different kinds of instruments. There are many hundreds of instruments in the Parkfield area.
Okay.
And the reason is that we've seen from many earthquakes around the world that there are physical precursors, physical things that change prior to earthquakes. But we haven't been able to study them in enough detail to be really sure when we see those changes when the earthquake's going to occur. Anyway, we've only been able to work in the one area in Parkfield, and Loma Prieta would have been one of the areas we would have liked to have instrumented, and we might have been able to see some precursor to the earthquake.
Yeah, there's something called the Global Positioning System.
Well, since I don't work for the GS, I can more freely say, yes, they're underfunded.
Okay.
Yes, they should be doing more, not only basic science and research and prediction with these kinds of instrumentation programs, they ought to also be doing mapping of ground shaking potential. I mean, the budget is an embarrassment, and I think that we could double or triple the funding going into research, into earthquakes, into ground motion, into potential shaking, and actually help the mitigation effort, because when you have better information, you can convince people to do things differently.
I think really the most important lessons we got from the Loma Prieta earthquake was first, not only that the earthquake occurred where we thought it was going to occur, but much more specifically, the places the damage occurred were exactly the places that we had mapped many years before as saying these are the regions where the most damage is likely to occur.
I was looking at a map you all did of San Francisco, and you pinpointed the mission, I'm sorry, the Marina District as violent earthquake shaking possibility.
The Marina District was very severely shook in 1906. It was a lagoon, but around the edge of the lagoon was one of the regions of highest shaking in the 1906 earthquake. Then they went and they filled the marina with sand, liquefied sand, pumped it in with debris from the 1906 earthquake, plowed it all over, had a fair, and then another decade later or so, they started building on top of it again. It was a garbage dump, and it became very important real estate. And it's a severe lesson of what ignoring the earthquake problem leads to. Back in the early 1900s, they wanted to cover up the fact that the earthquake had caused a lot of damage, and they wanted to get on with life.
How much of California has been mapped in this manner?
Basically, the Bay Area has been prototype mapped. Okay. Because this is an area where the Geological Survey has a major office, we've done the kinds of maps in San Mateo County and in some of the other parts of the Bay Area that ought to be done. But this is the kind of work that could be done in much more detail throughout the many different counties, and it gives a basis to decide where the damage will be in the next earthquake.
Right. It's not just in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, the entire Southern California basin is at very high risk. The central United States needs this kind of mapping. The Northeast in Massachusetts, down through New York, needs the same kind of mapping. South Carolina, where they had an earthquake in 1886. The entire country, to a great extent, is at risk, and this kind of mapping, which we've been able to concentrate in the Bay Area, is extremely helpful for building as well as mitigation.
Let's talk about the rest of the country real quick. There are certain areas that seem to be at enormous risk. The largest earthquake in American history, as I understand it, was in Missouri.
The Boot Heel in Missouri in 1811 and 1812, 3 quakes, each of which were about the same size as the San Francisco 1906 quake.
There's a lot of population there. There's a lot of infrastructure. There's almost no earthquake preparedness, as I understand.
Very little. They're starting a program there similar to BayREP's program, but it has to cover 6 states and hundreds of jurisdictions. And it's a real political problem. They also have very limited building codes until very recently.
Buildings.
They have brick buildings. They have old concrete buildings. A lot of schools which are made out of brick. And the kinds of buildings we should be building better, they just haven't addressed.
They also have pipelines running through along the Mississippi River, oil and gas.
Oil and gas pipelines from Texas to the Northeast run through that area.
So a major quake in Missouri might take out a lot of the energy for the Northeast.
Right. If it happens in the winter, it can be very cold in the Northeast.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the things that can be done locally. What should the cities be doing right now? Retrofitting their buildings?
I think one of the most important things is to begin to set priorities, to begin to understand where the hazards are. Based on the type of mapping we've been talking about and the type of studies that people can do just identifying which buildings are likely to fall down, we can now have the techniques to say, this is where the damage is most likely to occur, these are the specific buildings that are most likely to occur.
Now, how well do we do?
We know the kinds of buildings that are a problem.
I mean, did our infrastructure, our public buildings hold up pretty well in the last one?
No. In fact, the buildings that we thought would be damaged were damaged. Old brick buildings. City Hall in San Francisco was closed. The city office buildings in Oakland have been closed since the earthquake. Mm-hmm. The state office building in Oakland, which is an old concrete building, has been closed since the earthquake. And we know these buildings are hazardous. We've seen them damaged in previous quakes, and yet even the state, local governments, haven't taken the threat seriously enough to strengthen the buildings.
Well, one of the problems, as I understand it, is this is an enormous expense to retrofit all these buildings.
Absolutely.
And you have to float a bond. Bonds don't pass. You also have you have a balancing act you got to do. I was reading that the Cypress structure was recognized as being very vulnerable to a quake. Mm-hmm. But at the time, the feeling was the choice was either spend it on rebuilding the Cypress structure right now or go down and widen Highway 52 over Pacheco Pass. And in terms, if you want to get coarse about this, in terms of total deaths, Pacheco Pass was a greater risk. Mm-hmm. At what point do you decide that the risk from a quake is greater than everyday life? How do you divert the funds the right way?
I think the Cypress structure is a perfect example of how cost-effective remedial action could be. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's been determined now from the engineers studying the Cypress structure that a few more steel bands and bolts around the pillars would have probably prevented that from collapsing. When you think of the cost of putting those steel bands and bolts in the pillars, just compared to the emergency cost of getting 42 bodies out of there, to say nothing of replacing the whole Cypress structure, it becomes obvious that it would have been much more cost-effective to have done that in 1982.
Right. In fact, we do have numbers. We strengthened, since 1971 when we had the freeways collapse in the San Fernando earthquake, we strengthened 1,300 bridges. We spent roughly $53 million to strengthen those bridges. None of those bridges were damaged in this quake, even the ones very close to the epicenter. $53 million. Since the earthquake, we spent over $300 million cleaning up the debris. What's cost-effective? I mean, we could have prevented that structure from collapsing.
But as
if we would have committed
we enter into the ugly realm of politics.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to sell another lane on the freeway.
Absolutely.
With its immediate return on investment than it is to spend money on something that may never be used.
Well, you mentioned earlier the short attention span of the general public. It's also public officials. Mm-hmm. And we have, I think now, a window of opportunity, and I don't mean to be trite about this, but we have a period of time where people are focused on the earthquake. And if we're going to affect change, if we're going to make sure our buildings are safe, we have to do it now. If we wait 3 or 4 years, the interest will wane, the attention will be gone, and we'll be dealing with something else. And we saw that happen in 1971, where a period of 3 or 4 years we had a dam safety program, a hospital act program, freeway strengthening, school strengthening, and then petered out. You know, if we don't hit the ground running now to get to these old buildings, the opportunity will be missed.
Any estimates on the cost to do all this?
Billions. Billions.
I mean, that's billions and billions is a large number.
It is.
Any more precise number?
We're talking about 40,000 plus unreinforced brick buildings in California. Start with that. We have probably 10,000 non-ductile concrete, old concrete buildings that are brittle. They're not 2 stories high like the Cypress, but they're 15 stories high.
Okay.
And they're high occupancy. Those buildings are going to talk.
Do we need more draconian codes? Like right now, you don't build a building now until you incorporate all the new features?
We have
Do we make them stronger?
We make them retroactive.
Okay.
We go back and get all those old buildings.
Okay.
Current construction is not so much of a problem as the older construction.
Yeah.
When we talk about billions, it's important to realize during the Loma Prieta earthquake, in 15 seconds, there was $6 billion worth of damage done. But for the Hayward Fault earthquake, the projections are in 1989 or 1990 dollars, we're talking about $70 billion. Right. This is perhaps twice the total retail sales of everything that's sold in Northern California. We're talking about a lot of money in about 15 seconds. So while it's billions to get ready for that earthquake, it's going to be billions to survive it and to pass through it. So what's important now is that we set priorities. We begin to realize where the weakest links are. The technology is available now to say, these are the most dangerous areas. These are the places where people are going to be killed. These are the places where we're going to disrupt the economy worst. Let's get to work on those areas, and gradually we'll work on many of the other areas. But we first just need to inventory it and say, here, this is the specific problem.
Real quick before I run out of time, let's say we have one on the Hayward Fault. So we have one right now on the Hayward Fault. Do we have the emergency preparedness in place to deal with 4,500 dead, 150,000 injured?
No.
What will it take?
We have now a state plan that's less than a year old, that its first test was in Loma Prieta, and it's being changed and refined. We have a federal response
Did it do
plan.
okay during that?
Yes. But this was
Give it a grade.
I would give it an A, but this was primarily a local emergency. It was not a state response. A Hayward earthquake will be a state response and a federal response. And I think that we have a lot to do with the state and the federal level to upgrade our capability so we can respond more rapidly. And local governments, very uneven. Some are strong, some are weak, some have the capability, some don't.
Give me some strong ones.
I would say
and
Hayward.
Weak ones.
I would say Hayward. Oakland is extremely good. Berkeley is working to upgrade. The other communities I don't know.
Tell me something. Do you guys ever feel like Chicken Little or Cassandra running around warning everybody that the walls of Troy are coming down and beware of earthquakes and that sort of thing? I mean, are they listening to you out there?
Well, it's been a real problem. I mean, we want very much to have people realize that there is a significant threat. There's something that needs to be done. We need to be concerned that something is coming and that there are concrete actions we can take. At the same time, not try to scare them or not let them be scared to the point where they say, oh, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
Well, we've been called the Chicken Littles of earthquake preparedness over the last 8 years, and I think we've been trying to get the message out that the threat is real, that there are practical things you can do. You can change the outcome of these earthquakes by making sure your homes are safe, your workplace is safe, and your structures are safe. And I think now we have people's attention. October 17th got everyone's attention.
Yeah, but do you have legislators' attention over the long term? Are they going to move on to new topics?
I think we have them in the short term, and we're going to make a difference in the short term. And the laws that they pass are going to make a difference in the long term.
Can you get enough money in the short term to do what you need to do? I mean, isn't this like a 10-year or 20-year program it's going to take to do all this retrofitting and rebuilding and recoding and everything else?
Well, I think we have the money from the state. The real question is whether we can get the federal resources, not just to California, but to the entire country.
If the state has a deficit, the federal government has a deficit, where's the money come from? I mean, if it comes down to building more schools and more daycare centers or improving the roads or earthquake preparedness, which one do you think is going to get the money first?
Well, the earthquakes are coming.
Yeah.
And when the earthquake hits, where's the money coming from? It's just a matter of what you set your priorities as.
Okay.
If there's a peace dividend, I hope it goes into making our communities safer, not only just to people on the street and dealing with drugs and the social problems, but in earthquake preparedness as well.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank you both for being on the show. You certainly sufficiently scared me. I want to thank you at home for watching Malone and for supporting public television. Keep those letters coming in. Good night.